Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. During our last lecture, you learned about Alexander the Great and his conquest of the Near East, or his conquest of Asia. Of course, you also learned that Alexander the Great's men refused to go any further once they hit that Indus Valley. They are just tired, they want to go home. They've been on the road for years and years, and so Alexander is forced to turn around, to turn back and head toward Macedonia, or Macedon, which was their home state. And you probably also heard that Alexander the Great decided to take a different route. He decided to do a little bit more exploring on his way, which he does. He takes a more southerly route through the desert, and it was very hard for his men. In fact, Alexander will not survive much longer. Your textbook talks about tired and maybe alcoholism, drinking too much alcohol. There's different talk about how Alexander died, because he was only in his early 30s when he died, and he never made it back to Macedon or Macedonia. He was obviously not prepared. I know that you learned he won every major battle, even when Alexander the Great was outnumbered. He still defeated his enemies. Darius III, the Persian king, for example. So Alexander the Great didn't have a plan. He didn't have a successor in place. He did have a son. Remember, he had encouraged intermarriage between Greeks and non-Greeks, and he himself practiced what he preached and married a princess from what's the area that is modern-day Afghanistan now. He made it as far as Afghanistan. But there was nothing in place for when Alexander died. But when Alexander went on these conquests, he will be the one to start what is called the Hellenistic Age. Remember, the word Hellenic means Greek. The word Hellenistic means a combination of Greek and Near Eastern culture. Alexander the Great is discovering and building new cities called Alexandria. No ego problem for him, obviously. And this intermarriage between Greeks and non-Greeks, we're having a blending of cultures that will start this Hellenistic Age. Well, because Alexander the Great did not have a succession plan in place, we find that his generals will divvy up the spoils of Alexander the Great's empire. They will fight, and they will split up the empire into different sections. Egypt, of course, will be its own section under the Ptolemies. You have Macedonia under the Antigonids. You have the area of Syria under the Seleucids, etc. You'll learn more about that. But either way, this empire of Alexander the Great was very short-lived. And we start to have division again in this area of the world. Now, as far as the Hellenistic Age is concerned, you'll learn about the differences between Hellenistic politics and Greek politics. Remember, the Greeks weren't very hip on the king and the monarchy. I mean, they had started off that way, but eventually, they had the archons and they had their assemblies and their councils, but you're not seeing like King Pericles. That was not the case. Or King Alcibiades, not the case. So the Greeks weren't very excited about monarchy. And we'll see, of course, that the Hellenistic politics will differ from this, as you can imagine, with this blending of cultures here. Now, the Greeks actually had associated the monarchy with Persia. King Darius I, King Xerxes, King Darius III, etc. The Hellenistic monarchies relied on Greeks and Macedonians as the ruling class. So the Greeks still played a very relevant role during this Hellenistic period, which is the period after the death of Alexander the Great. Now, the natives of these different populations that managed to climb up the ladder, so to speak, learned Greek, and they worked with the Greeks, cooperated. And we'll also notice during the Hellenistic period that these monarchies used military force to maintain control of their kingdoms. So the military is very important during the Hellenistic era. The size of the army increases during this time. There was a lot of use of mercenaries, which actually Philip II of Macedonia, the father of Alexander the Great, he used mercenaries, professional soldiers, soldiers who are paid to fight. The cavalry was still used, of course. Elephants, which were actually used previous to this, but we're starting to see that becoming more prevalent. They're kind of like the tanks of ancient warfare. We have siege machines. You know, Philip II, again, the father of Alexander the Great, had come up with a better catapult, twisting rope to give it more force, to break through some of these walls of these cities. Alexander the Great had expanded upon this use of the catapult by building siege towers so that his men could climb up and therefore breach the city walls, I guess you could say. So fortified cities are going to be captured. It's not like they are inaccessible to enemy armies or anything of that nature. Now, the Hellenistic economy, we're going to see that trade is growing and cities were growing. We have some major inventions during the time. The Archimedean screw is one. It helped pump water out of the mines or into irrigation trenches, which was very helpful. We also have, you learned about Greek philosophy or Hellenic philosophy. We're also going to see here during the Hellenistic period what is called Hellenistic philosophy, with men such as Diogenes, who was a cynic. I know you've heard of the word cynic before, and it's neat that it has relevance there. Epicureanism was a Hellenistic philosophy. Stoicism, you may have heard of the definition of to be stoic by Zeno, is another. And skeptics, or skepticism, was also an actual Hellenistic philosophy that comes out of this period. Now, there were also advances in science and medicine. Aristarchus is sometimes called the Hellenistic Copernicus with his heliocentric theory, belief that the earth revolves around the sun and the sun does not revolve around the earth, helio. The earth revolves around the sun. He's just one, of course. So it's not that once the Hellenic age is over that things just stop or go stagnant. We'll see with the Hellenistic era, the Hellenistic age, that society and culture are still growing and are still advancing.
Hi, today we are going to talk about the Hellenistic civilization. And it was the conquests of Alexander the Great that actually laid the foundation for this Hellenistic civilization. This was a time when Greek culture was spread to vast areas way beyond Greece. And the word Hellenistic sounds a lot like the word that we used before in a previous lecture, Hellenic. Well, we want to differentiate between the two. Hellenic means Greek, and Hellenistic means Greek-like. So it's going to be a mixture, I guess you could say, an amalgamation of Greek culture infusing with other cultures in what was, we call, Alexander's empire. So Greek language, Greek art, Greek architecture, and of course literature and other things that the Greeks did will spread to vast areas in the Near East, and again, it will fuse with other cultures. So again, it was Alexander the Great that, quote, laid the foundation for this Hellenistic culture. After the death of Alexander, we want to talk a little bit about that after his death, his military leaders were in a struggle as to who would be next in command. Eventually, what they did was to divide his empire into three main parts. Now, of course, it gets divided a little bit more than that, but we're going to focus on three main parts of what was Alexander's empire. For example, in Egypt, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, set himself up as Pharaoh, and his descendants would rule Egypt like pharaohs. Well, not like pharaohs, they were pharaohs, they became pharaohs. They would be, Ptolemy and his descendants would be the, quote, god kings of Egypt all the way until the Roman period when we get to Cleopatra VII. So for the next 300 years, Ptolemy's line would rule Egypt. And we're going to talk more about Egypt in just a moment. The other part of the kingdom would be given to Antigonus, and this would be Macedonia and Greece. So Antigonus would control Macedonia and Greece and start a kingdom that is often referred to as the Antigonid Kingdom of Macedonia. Now, we're not going to say much of anything about them. The third, shall we say, part of Alexander's kingdom would be mostly Asia Minor and some territory toward India, and this would be known as the Seleucid Kingdom, which was started by the man that we call Seleucus. So the Seleucid Kingdom, or the Seleucid Kingdom, would be the third part of what was Alexander's empire. Let's talk for a few more minutes about the Kingdom of Egypt. Now, what was it called? Well, it was called the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, named after Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander's generals. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that his line would rule Egypt for the next 300 years. Well, this is the kingdom that would last the longest, the kingdom or the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. This one would last the longest out of these three main ones that I have mentioned to you. So it's worth, shall we say, discussing this kingdom and some of its, I'll use the term, attributes just a little bit more in detail. So the Hellenistic, shall we say, culture was spread to Egypt too, as well as the other areas that I mentioned. But we want to mention that the Ptolemaic kings and queens of Egypt will be ruling just like the pharaohs, and they were pharaohs. Some of the Hellenistic queens of Egypt would take what we would call a more prominent role than the women of the past in Egypt. And some of these queens are going to, shall we say, exert some great power. Ptolemy's descendants ruled Egypt until the reign of until the reign of Cleopatra VII, and that would be during the Roman period, and we will possibly mention that later. Cleopatra, of course, you'll find out more about her during the lecture during your third unit about Rome. Anyway, in Egypt during this Ptolemaic period, we have Alexandria, Egypt. One thing I want to briefly mention before we go on, and this is just an interesting point, is that when Alexander conquered this vast Persian Empire, he named many cities after himself. So there were many cities named Alexandria. However, Alexandria, Egypt, is going to become a, shall I say, very, very prominent city. It became the leading city in the Hellenistic world. And there was a great port in Alexandria, and it definitely was the home of what became one of what the Greeks called the seven wonders of the world. It was the home, Alexandria, Egypt, was the home of this great lighthouse that was built. Remember, I said it was a port city, and there was this huge lighthouse that was built just outside the harbor at Alexandria. And it was very, very big. It was like 440 something feet tall, and it again was regarded as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Not only did Alexandria have this great lighthouse, Alexandria had other things that were prominent in the Greek, or well, we'll call this the Hellenistic world. For example, Alexandria was the cultural center of the Hellenistic world. It was Alexandria where people would go to learn and to study, because in Alexandria there was a great museum that was built, and part of this museum was a library. Not just a small library, but a very huge library. A library that contained over 500,000 scrolls. It contained much of the knowledge of the ancient world at that time. It was the largest collection of knowledge that the ancient world had ever seen. So this was phenomenal. And people came from all over the Hellenistic world to this great library at Alexandria, Egypt. So definitely there was a lot of studying going on there. Let's also mention very quickly that during this Hellenistic period, we see what we would call a transformation in education. For example, before this time, the Greeks had, shall we say, what we call the gymnasium, or what we call the gymnasium. Before that time, it was mainly a place of doing athletics. But during the Hellenistic period, the gymnasium would now include more than just it would be more than just an athletic institution. They would be learning all kinds of, shall we say, other topics like music, like, well, including exercise, as we mentioned, and they would also be studying things like literature. So the gymnasium expands during the Hellenistic period. Another thing we would like to say about the Hellenistic period is that we want to take another look at the city of Athens. We heard about Athens during the classical period, and we saw a lot of phenomenal things happening as far as art, as far as literature, as far as, and of course this is connected to literature as well, as far as theatrics, drama, and that sort of thing. So Athens continued during the Hellenistic period to be, I guess you could say, the theatrical center of the Greek world. During this period, the Greeks produced a different type of comedy, a comedy that was simply meant to entertain, and what some of your textbooks would call a quote, new comedy. A comedy, I guess we could say that was representative of this playwright that we call Menander. Menander was a great comedic playwright during this period, and his plays often focused on, shall we say, a story of a man who falls in love with a young woman whom he cannot attain. For some reason, she's unattainable. But then the stories end up to where they work out the differences or the problems, and you see what I would call a, quote, happily ever after ending. And that's something that's quite interesting. And let's give you an example of one of these comedic plays of Menander, because the plot lines were similar and quite amusing. A young man falls in love with a not so really bad prostitute who eventually turns out to be the long-lost daughter of a rich neighbor. And of course, the Greeks would think that was hilarious, and then the man would then marry her, and they would live happily ever after. You also see during this time period Hellenistic novels that depict similar themes where you have this type of storyline, much in the way of entertainment. And this comedy is different from the kind of comedy that the Greeks had before. Another thing I would like to mention is that there was a lot of literature that was produced during the Hellenistic period, but unfortunately, most of it does not exist today. We have historical, we have biographical literature, and we do want to mention that the most prominent historian of this period was a man called Polybus. And his major work originally consisted of around 40 books. I mean, this man had written about 40 books about the history of, quote, the inhabited Mediterranean world. And unfortunately, only the first 5 books out of the 40 and parts of the others remain today. Another thing, art continued to flourish during the Hellenistic period. You know how we talked about the Greek classical art? Well, we have lots of art during this period. We have architecture, we have lots of building. They're building things like baths, they're building amphitheaters, they're building schools, they're building temples. Again, the Hellenistic culture spread to most of what was the Persian Empire that Alexander had conquered. One of the most popular types of architecture during this time period was what we would call Corinthian, and that is something that was discussed in the Hellenistic, the Hellenistic unit. No, the Hellenic unit. We studied a little bit about the capitals as far as the columns of the Greek architecture. Corinthian was one of the most ornate styles, and it was very popular during this Hellenistic period. We have thousands of statues that were created during this period. We have sculpture that is different. The sculpture is less idealistic, and I like to use the phrase more realistic. And I will compare the Hellenistic sculpture briefly to the sculpture that came before in the Hellenic classical period. This time we see sculpture that again is less idealistic, more realism, and I'll use an example. There's sculptures of old women, there's sculptures of children, and we also have a new emphasis placed on female nudes, whereas in the classical period there was more focus on maid nude males, and the bodies being, quote, more than perfect. Now we see actually more realism in the Hellenistic sculpture. We also would like to talk about Hellenistic philosophy. You heard about the Hellenic philosophy from Dr. Forrest, and some of this might be a little bit similar, but yet very different. The earliest Hellenistic philosophical movement was the movement of the people that we like to call the Cynics. And the man who became the leader of the Cynics, or cynicism, as we would call this type of philosophy, was a man called Diogenes. So Diogenes was the leader of this movement. There were some other prominent ones, but this man really stands out. Diogenes, from around 350 or so BC. This man was thoroughly disgusted with what he called the hypocrisy and materialism in Athens. So he thought that people focused too much on material things. So this man gave up material things. He actually slept in what amounted to a tub, and he begged for a living. He slept, again, in what we call the marketplace in a tub. And I know that sounds really strange. I mean, this is considered very radical philosophy, and some of the Greeks would try to adhere to it, but it would be kind of difficult. So this man called Diogenes became, shall we say, notorious for his philosophical stunts, such as carrying a lamp in the daytime. He would be going around carrying a lamp in the daytime, saying that he was looking for an honest man. So he didn't think much of what he saw in mainstream Greek society at that time. So he claimed he was looking for an honest man. Diogenes said there was only one good, and that was knowledge. And only one evil, and that was ignorance. As far as other things, we don't even want to talk about some of the things that these cynics did as far as, let's just say, sanitation things. And we will leave it at that. He and his followers believed that the material world was evil and it needed to be rejected. That's interesting. And of course, for the cynics, this meant rejecting things like wealth, power, fame, and by living, quote, a simple life that was free from all material possessions. And they believed that this was the only real way of achieving happiness. Sounds pretty strange, doesn't it? The only way of achieving happiness, to give up all your material things. Well, it may not sound strange to some people. But anyway, the cynics believed in living a natural life. And they avoided things like culture, of course. They avoided the cultural activities of the cities, and they did lead very simple lives. That is, the ones who could adhere to this type of difficult, I would say, lifestyle. They advocated self-sufficiency. They recommended a withdrawal from society. So we pretty much understand that by this point. And by the way, Diogenes was called Kynos, or Kinos, by the people of Athens, which means dog. So we actually get the word cynic from the Greek word for dog. It means to be like a dog. The term cynic, it means to be like a dog, and some of these people were literally living like a dog, living like beasts, as you could say. So, what is the goal for the cynics? The goal is to achieve happiness. How do you do that? You become more natural. You live as simple as the animals, as simple as the dogs. And happiness depends on being self-sufficient, and you must master your mental attitudes. Now, there's a story about Alexander, you know, Alexander the Great, a story about Alexander and this Diogenes character. The story says that Alexander wanted to meet this man. He was considered by many a great philosopher. And so supposedly Alexander was so happy to meet this man, and he asked Diogenes if he could, maybe, what can I do for you? Could I do a favor for you? Or something along those lines. And Diogenes pretty much replied to Alexander the Great, mind you, yeah, you could get out of my sunlight, move away, so I can be, shall we say, bathing in the sunlight. Yes, stand out of my sunlight. So we see variations of this story about Diogenes telling Alexander the Great, of all people, to get out of my way. I'm trying to sun myself. I think it's hilarious. And there are many other stories about cynics and what they would have to say. One of the stories that was told to me was from a professor of this class many years ago, who had said that, according to one story, Alexander the Great had asked a cynic whether or not the city of Thebes should be rebuilt. And the city of Thebes had, just to remind you, or in case you didn't know, had rebelled against Alexander, and he and his armies ended up destroying the city, obliterating it, and killing the men and sending the women off into slavery. But anyway, so the cynic supposedly asks, should Thebes be rebuilt? And the cynic replied something like, why? Another Alexander would surely tear it down again. So that kind of, I'll use the word attitude, we sometimes see in people in the modern times. You try to tell them about something positive and then they shoot it down. So that's, we use that term cynical in our society to describe what you might call negative people. Very simplistically, I say that. Anyway, another Hellenistic philosophy was very different. They had a very different way of achieving happiness. They, I guess you could say, offered practical solutions to find happiness in this world. And the famous person who supposedly gets this philosophy started is a man called Epicurus. And of course, the name of this philosophy is Epicureanism. So first we have cynicism, then we have Epicureanism. Now this one originated just a little bit later, for example, around 300 BC or so, this Epicurean philosophy. And Epicurus, by the way, was from Athens. And he started this philosophy that was weirdly or strangely enough based on his theory that the universe was made of randomly colliding atoms, of all things. And he did not, Epicurus rather, he did not believe that gods played any active roles in the world. As a matter of fact, he and his followers believed that the universe is entirely material. So according to the Epicureans, happiness would come from seeking pleasure in this world, seeking pleasure, being free from pain, being free from worry. Epicurean, Epicureanism, the pursuit of pleasure was the only true good. Oh, but there's more to the story. Yes, yes, the Epicureans call for the pursuit of pleasure, but in moderation. We're not talking about overeating, over-drinking. They didn't call for that. Overeating and over-drinking should be avoided, according to the Epicureans. You know what happens. If you eat too much, you'll get sick. If you drink too much, you'll have a hangover. So to them, that was a no-no. You don't overeat, you don't overdrink. They called for the pursuit of happiness. They called for avoiding politics, or what some historians would call political atheism, a withdrawal from public life, a withdrawal from politics. Pursuit of happiness. So the highest pleasure is the moderate satisfaction of the bodily appetites. Mental pleasures, that would bring you peace, freedom from worry, a mind at rest. Happiness can be achieved also, according to the Epicureans, by eliminating fear. And the Epicureans said that one of the biggest fears was people being afraid of the supernatural. So get rid of the fear of the supernatural. The gods are not involved in your lives. They're not doing anything. They're not being involved in your lives. That's what the Epicureans thought. Retirement from politics, retirement from public competition. Concentrate on friendship. Concentrate on private enjoyment. Happiness would be achieved by mental pleasures and, of course, by satisfying the bodily appetites in moderation. Interesting philosophy, those Epicureans. So the Epicureans are not wanting to be, quote, political people, as you understand. Now we're going to talk about a philosophy known as Stoicism. Eventually, Epicureanism is going to be overshadowed by this one. In other words, Stoicism is eventually going to become the most popular philosophy of the Hellenistic world. And then Stoicism will become the most popular philosophy of the Roman world that you'll hear about later. The word Stoicism comes from the word stoa, which stoas were the covered walkways that surrounded the marketplace. Stoa, a covered walkway that surrounded the marketplace. And the founder of this philosophy, called Stoicism, was none other than a man named Zeno. Zeno was also from Athens. And this philosophy emerged roughly around the same time that the Epicurean philosophy started, around 300 BC or so. Now, what did this Zeno believe? And of course, he's going to get many, many followers. He believed that people could possess material goods as long as they were not attached to them. So remember, the cynics were like, get rid of everything, get rid of all your material goods and live like, quote, the beasts. But this Stoicism thing said that people could possess material goods as long as they were not attached to them. Zeno and his followers argued in favor of a universal God of reason. A God that governed the universe. A God. That's interesting. So we see we see some of these philosophers moving towards what we would call, shall we say, monotheism. But anyway, so they're arguing in favor of a universal God of reason that governed the universe, and they believed that everyone in the universe had a role. Everyone had their own particular role in the universe, that things were divinely ordered, and all roles were of equal value. All people and all their roles were of equal value. They, the Stoics, were also concerned with happiness, but they went about, quote, achieving happiness in a different way. Stoics believed that happiness could be found in virtue, which meant living in harmony with the divine will. Living in harmony with the divine will, well, that sounds kind of like people accepting their fate. Well, yes, it was that. Happiness was achieved by choosing to follow the divine will, and of course, by exercising your own free will, but accepting your fate. To the Stoics, divine will was the same as the will of nature. Living according to nature. This is not the same thing as what the Cynics believed. This is different. Living according to nature meant following the natural laws that govern the universe. Living according to nature. If you can accept whatever fate gives you, whatever life dishes out, then you would be happy, according to the Stoics. So let's take a closer look at that. Whatever you receive in life is divine will, according to the Stoics. If you can accept it, you'll have peace, accepting your fate. So, the ideal Stoic endured whatever he faced, including pain, including suffering, without being passionate or angry. So the Stoics believed that fate has a way of working things out for the ultimate good. It may seem bad to you now, but it's the way it's, quote, supposed to be. All things happen for a reason. People should submit to their fate. And another thing, too, that's kind of interesting about the Stoics is they taught tolerance and forgiveness of one another. The Stoics were definitely involved in politics. They believed that civic duty was very important. Civic duty, duty and self-discipline were very high virtues of the Stoics. Duty and self-discipline. There was another philosophy that I'll mention very quickly. It was called skepticism, and this one was considered very radical. So we're not going to say a whole lot about it, but the skeptics believed that all knowledge comes from the perception of the senses. They said, how can you, quote, prove anything? If all knowledge comes from the senses, you have to say that, knowledge is limited. You cannot prove anything. If knowledge comes from the perception of the senses, how can you prove anything? You'll have to say that things appear to be like this or appear to be like that. No definite knowledge. No definite knowledge about supernatural things, according to the skeptics. No definite knowledge about what's right and wrong. And they said we need to stop looking for the truth. Stop worrying about things like good and evil. And then you'll have peace. After all, that's what we want. We want happiness. We want peace of mind. We want satisfaction. So, many of the leaders, many of society's leaders in the Greek world would be replacing religion with one of these types of philosophies, whether it be Epicureanism, whether it be skepticism, whether it be Stoicism. And most ordinary people, but now for the time being, are going to be following what I would call emotional or personal religions that might offer salvation in the next life. So let's talk about, for a few minutes, what we call mystery religion, or mystery religions, I must say. There were many what we call mystery religions during the Hellenistic period. They were based on the same fundamental belief to be secretly initiated into a union with a savior god or goddess who had somehow died and risen again. So you would symbolically die and rise again and follow this, quote, mystery religion, whatever that might be. Mystery cults included the worship of fertility goddesses like Demeter. Remember, Demeter was the Greek goddess of grain. You might also have mystery religion following what many people would call the Great Mother, Sybil. She was a healing and protecting goddess, a guardian of nature. However, the most popular of these so-called mystery religions was the cult of Isis. The cult of Isis emerged from Egypt, and it became popular. It started spreading, and many people were following this Egyptian cult of Isis. It had become truly universal during the Hellenistic period. It had spread to many places. It spreads all over the, quote, Hellenistic world and even to Rome. Isis was the goddess of women, the goddess of marriage, the goddess of children. But many people viewed her also as a great lawgiver, a great giver of many things. And of course, what was so very much attractive about this religion was that it offered salvation in the next life. It offered eternal life. And of course, that was very important to many people, to be able to have the belief that they could live on after their body dies. We may not realize that, but many historians would agree on this, that these mystery religions, and I only mentioned a few, during the Hellenistic period helped to pave the way for Christianity. Now let's briefly mention a little bit about science. Science and medicine during the Hellenistic period. Science and medicine. How can we say this? There was a brilliant age of science during this Hellenistic period. We have science like astronomy. We have mathematics, for example. We have geography. We have medicine and physics, just to name a few. The most important achievements came in the field of mathematics. Now, mathematics is something that is kind of complicated for one who is a historian. But nonetheless, there was a man called Euclid of Alexandria. And he is considered one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. Euclid of Alexandria. He presented a much more complex geometry than what had ever been used before, they say. His work in mathematics became the standard work on the study of mathematics for quite some time. He wrote about mathematics, and of course, he laid, with his mathematics, he laid the foundations for Hellenistic astronomy. Astronomy and mathematics are tied together. And that's something you would find out more about if you take History 102 and learn about a man called Isaac Newton. Astronomy and mathematics are tied. Anyway, which brings us to, briefly, another man called Aristarchus of Samos. Aristarchus of Samos developed what we call a heliocentric view of the universe. So he's claiming something, or he's coming out with this, we'll say, theory that goes against what the ancient Greeks first believed. He's calling for what we mention as a heliocentric view of the universe. He's claiming that the sun remained stationary and the earth revolved around it. And of course, I know some of you were saying, well, isn't that how it is? Well, back then, the Greeks didn't think that's how it was. And this guy also argued that the earth rotates on its axis. This view, what was it called? The heliocentric view of the universe, where the sun is the center of the universe, was not widely accepted because most of the scholars at that time were committed to believing in the geocentric view of the universe. That's right. They believed that the earth was the center of the universe. And they didn't want to give up that belief. The geocentric view that claimed that the earth was the center of the universe. Another astronomer, by the way, this geocentric view that the earth is the center of the universe is going to be dominant all the way until we get to someone called Galileo, and that's, of course, going to be in a 102 class. Another astronomer determined that the earth was round, and he actually mathematically calculated the circumference of the world. I mean, this is something that's quite amazing, because they say that he was able to calculate the circumference of the world within like 200 miles of its actual size. So this is absolutely phenomenal. Now we want to mention the man that we would call the greatest scientist. We like to call him the greatest scientist of the Hellenistic period, and he was called Archimedes. Archimedes lived in Sicily in a place called Syracuse, and he was very famous during his lifetime, and of course he continues to be very famous to people who study history and science. Archimedes is also considered usually to be the greatest mathematician of antiquity. And some people even say the greatest mathematician of all time. But I guess it would depend on which historian you talk to, but definitely a phenomenal mathematician. His work on geometry and spheres and cylinders, things that would confuse most historians who've never really studied that sort of thing, but his work on all this stuff is extremely important. He established what we call the mathematical constant of pi. He created the science of hydrostatics. This man was brilliant. He also was a practical inventor. He invented all kinds of things. Some of the things that he was able to do, we're still not sure how he did it. And I'll give you an example in a moment. He made physics separate from philosophy. It used to be that physics was tied in with philosophy, and he made it separate. He discovered what we call specific gravity. This man was a thinker. Always thinking, thinking, thinking. And I'll tell you a story about the specific gravity thing too. He formulated the principles of the lever. He came up with the compound pulley, and many people give him the credit for coming up with the idea of the screw. The Archimedean screw was something that was used to pump water out of mines. It would lift water out of mines, and it would lift irrigation water up to higher places. It was phenomenal. Anyway, getting back to his specific gravity thing, he pondered ideas while he, they say, would be taking a bath. So he'd sit there and push his hand down in the water perhaps, and he noticed that the water would rise, it would become displaced. So they say that's how he discovered that, what we call specific gravity, by noticing that he displaced the water, especially like when he got into the tub, the water came up, that sort of thing. Push your hand down in the water and the water may rise. So one of the stories says that when he finally, quote, reached his conclusion, he jumped out of his bath, ran out in the streets, all excited about what he had, quote, discovered, shouting, "Eureka, I've found it." And of course, this is a famous story about Archimedes just running out naked into the streets, shouting, "Eureka." Another thing that I would like to mention very quickly about Archimedes is that there's a story of where the Romans were laying siege to the city of Syracuse, and Archimedes is supposed to have come up with a way of reflecting, shall we say, using mirrors, if you will, to literally burn the Roman ships. And many scientists still are trying to figure out exactly how he did it and exactly what did he use. Was it bronze shields or was it something else? And I am one that believes that there are many mysteries that remain to us as far as history is concerned that we don't or will not know for sure. But we also want to mention too, as far as Hellenistic science is concerned, we also want to mention medicine. There were some great achievements in medicine during this Hellenistic period, and we have to mention the greatest doctor of this period, and his name was Herophilus. Herophilus studied in Alexandria. And of course, you remember that Alexandria was the place where they had this great library where many people would come from all over the Hellenistic world and study. So one of those was this man, Herophilus, and get this, he performed human dissections. You know, he dissected dead bodies, but he also might even do some, and this sounds horrible, what they call vivisections on actually living people. And he was able to discover a lot of things about human anatomy. He was considered the first person to recognize that the brain was actually the seat of human intelligence and not the heart like the Egyptians had thought. He said it was the brain, and he was able to give a detailed description of the human brain. He had many other discoveries. For example, he discovered the significance of the pulse. He discovered that the arteries contain blood and that their function is to carry the blood from the heart to other parts of the body. Herophilus also helped for us to learn more about the liver, the eyes, and of course we already mentioned the brain. He also helped us to learn more about the reproductive organs of the body, even the nervous systems of the body. He was the first person, they say, in history to accurately describe the female anatomy as far as the reproductive organs were concerned. So we must emphasize this man. Herophilus is considered the greatest anatomist of antiquity. There was also some work done by another great physician during this time. He also performed dissection, and this was a man called Erasistratus. Erasistratus made some great discoveries as far as the process of digestion is concerned, and that is a man called Erasistratus. So I'd like to finalize today my lecture by briefly mentioning again that during the Hellenistic period, Greek culture was spread to many parts of the ancient Near East. It was spread to Egypt and even spread to the Roman world. We're just naming a few of the places. And it fused with some of the other cultures. And we see a lot taking place in the field of literature, writing. Lots of novels written during this time, believe it or not. We see new comedy. We see new advances in science and medicine. We see all kinds of things happening during this Hellenistic period.
Okay, so we learned a lot about the Hellenistic period. For our upcoming lecture, you'll learn a lot about the Etruscans. We'll start talking about the Romans and how they will grow and become an eventual empire. Until next time.